I know, 2 localization videos in a row, but I seriously believe that today's topic is something that is extremely important to the entire gaming community and needs to be discussed more, especially here on YouTube. So, what is that topic? Well, as you may or may not be aware, the game River City Girls 0, which is a port and localization of the until now Japan-only game known as Shin Nekketsu Koha Kunio Tachi no Banka, or New Hot-Blooded Tough Guy Elegy of Kunio and Friends, was recently released on most gaming platforms. The astute viewer will notice that the localized title is quite different from the original, and that is because it's based on the localized names for various games in the Kunio-kun series, which were localized as games containing the name River City. But that's not really important for what we're going to be discussing here today. In the new port, known as River City Girls 0, the developer, namely WayForward, has given fans 2 options when it comes to the dialogue of the game. One originally called Literal, which would give players an experience more faithful to the original game, and another originally called New, which would modify things to resemble the current tone of the River City Girls series. So if you're someone who enjoys close localizations, there's an option for you, and if you're someone who enjoys a more heavily localized experience, there's an option for you as well. Sounds like a win-win, right? Well, at least that's what the vast majority of fan reactions would have you believe. Just scrolling down the Twitter replies to the tweet that sparked all this, most everyone seems to be on board and praising WayForward for this decision. Many fans proclaim that this should be the industry standard, and that they love to see more games give players these kinds of options going forward. And from a player's standpoint, it's kind of hard to disagree with them. More options is always a good thing in my opinion, and this is an area of gaming that desperately needed more options. Up until now, I don't think many people really even considered the idea that we could have multiple translations for one game officially, but this has changed all that. Now we can cater to an even wider audience and make everyone happy, right? Well, that is, except for the many localizers who angrily quote retweeted this, claiming they're being undermined or something of a similar effect by the developers giving players more options. And reading these absolutely horrible and sometimes just straight up incorrect arguments tilted me so hard I just had to make a video about this. So let's go through some of these arguments and I'll tell you why many of them are extremely misleading and often just wrong or missing the point entirely. I won't be showing the names of these users for obvious reasons. Let's start off with this one that gained a good deal of traction. This user tries to outline point by point what is wrong with this situation, but fails on almost all of them in my opinion. Their first point is quoting the idea that literal translation is more accurate. They say different cultures use different words for different situations. In Japanese, you drink medicine, whereas in English, you take medicine. Our interpretations for words also vary, e.g. smart in Japanese means fashionable in English. Directly translating words can create mistranslations and inaccuracies, because even if the word seems the same, the intended meaning of the source text and/or the meaning or interpretation of the translation can vary from the source. While much of this is true in theory, this has nothing to do with the current conversation. Everyone knows that when WayForward said literal, they didn't actually mean they'd be translating every word individually using Google Translate. I've gone over this in the past, but in my opinion, even literal translation accounts for things like context, grammar, and approximations. And that's obviously what the intention was here. This user is trying to assert their status as a translator or a localizer to try to appear correct when in reality they've basically said nothing. Point 2. Localizations ruin media by changing the original. Localization is not a different type of translation. It is translation, and translation is localization. Translation, even literal translations, transforms the text in some way. With literal translations, meaning and characterization is lost, see point 1. The majority of major studio translations try to maintain the overall tone of the world and personalities of individual characters, translating it so the game writing is as entertaining as the source. You can't not transform the text in translation, all forms of translation, because language and cultural understandings are not one for one. Good translations will always maintain the original intent and tone while making the translation fluent and entertaining. As you may have noticed, this claim completely goes against the notion that literal translation causes inaccuracies because it is too direct. They basically said what I just got done saying about their first point, but then framed it as a new argument. Also, it is 100% possible to have a one-for-one translation. It doesn't happen extremely often, but it is still nevertheless possible. You can say I drink water in Japanese, and that translates one-for-one perfectly into English. In addition to this, the idea that translation and localization are one and the same is just straight up false. Localization is the process of adapting a piece of media to better suit a target audience, while translation is just the base concept of taking a piece of media in one language and moving it over to another without caring about adapting or modifying it. There's also this idea that most studio translations try to be faithful to the original, but just make the text more entertaining and fluid for the audience. I'm sure that there are some studios that try to follow this philosophy, but in my opinion they are in the minority. As someone who can speak both Japanese and English, I have the unique privilege of being able to cross-reference localization as I play many games. For example, when I played Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I used the Japanese voices and the English text. This meant that I could see in real time where things went astray from the original intentions of the Japanese developers. One thing that always sticks in my mind from that game is the name for the white tiger. In Japanese, he is called Byakko, which literally means white tiger, and comes from one of the great guardians of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean mythology. This idea of the Byakko is very common in modern Japanese media, and for that reason, many people that don't even speak Japanese know what it is. However, when this name went through localization, it was changed to Dromark. This presumably comes from the Welsh mythological creature of the same name that was said to be a white hound. Now, I didn't know that until I looked it up, and I feel like most people would be the same. So in what way does this enhance my enjoyment? Why am I having more fun now that his name is Dromark as opposed to Byakko? The answer is, I'm not. In fact, I'm having less fun because I can hear that his name was changed from a much cooler and much more well thought out Japanese name, and this is just one of many, many such changes throughout the game. And these changes eventually led to me losing interest in the game, and I stopped playing. If only there was, I don't know, an option to play with a more faithful localization, I might have actually played through to the end. In my opinion, the game wasn't objectively ruined because of these changes, but for me personally, they ruined the experience. That's the key distinction here. Giving players more options when it comes to localization does nothing but prevent this sort of problem from occurring, in my opinion. Point 2.5. Localizers censor media. This ties into the above myth. Localizations are always done by a team of people, never an individual, and if they decide a major change is needed, it's only done so after checking with the original creators. Once again, the first part of this is untrue, as many games, including the original Pokemon games, were translated by one person. Smaller games specifically can't afford a full team of localizers, so it's also common to see a single person on those types of games as well. The second part, that claims that all major changes are passed through the original creators, is also very misleading. While this is probably true, I'm sure there are instances where it is not. Also, when you as a localizer say to someone who doesn't speak the target language you're localizing a game into that you believe something must be changed, they're more likely to trust you because you're someone who knows that language and culture better than they do. They want their game to sell in your region, so they're inclined to believe you when you say something must be changed, when in reality, it's just your opinion that it should be changed. Also, yeah, localizers do censor media very often. That's just a fact that I don't really see how you can argue against. Point 3. The original language is awkward, so the translation should be too. Japanese is not awkward to a Japanese native speaker, so the translation shouldn't be awkward either. Translating into awkward English is another mistranslation of how the original reads. Awkward, which often comes from being literal or direct translations, undermine game writing too. If I wrote a beautiful, amazing text for a game, only to have it butchered in another language with direct, awkward wording, I'd be upset. This is just a restating of earlier points, so we're not going to talk about the first part, but the absolute lack of awareness with the ending of this quote is laughable. How do you think the original creators of games like Xenoblade and Fire Emblem feel when their hard work is butchered by heavy-handed localizers? Your job is not to write a beautiful, amazing script. It's to localize a game so it can be understood by the target audience. So many localizers have this idea in their head that they're creative writers who can do whatever they want with a game because no one's ever going to know, and that really rubs me the wrong way. If you wanted to create your own amazing script, you should have become a game writer, not a localizer. If anything, this concept of multiple types of translations for a single game should be a good thing for you because you can have both the creative freedom to write the localized script you want, as well as the one that you probably should have written, which is faithful to the original. You're arguing against freedom. This localizer seems to have intended to educate the masses about localization, but many of their points are very misleading and just untrue. Never trust someone just because they say they know best. This next person actually has some alright sounding points in the beginning of their reply tree, but as it goes down they seem to show their true colors. They start off by talking about how they believe their localizations aren't the one true localization, which is nice to hear, but later we get this quote. But for me to have a career, for companies to trust me with their games and demonstrate that trust has been repaid previously, that work I do needs to be singular for that release. I need a publisher to show my product is sellable on its own merits and that they have my back. Whatever happens after the fact is a separate conversation. As long as that work is tangible and I am credited, that's what counts. How could a translator like me demonstrate my insight and creative autonomy is worth paying for if it has to compete with itself in its own release? To me, this reads like, we as localizers arbitrarily change things very often because we have to add our own flavor to a game to be desirable as individuals. Now, I don't know if this is true of everyone, but it sure would make a lot of sense if that was the case. So many times when I see an arbitrary change, I just think, why? Why was this changed? It adds absolutely nothing to the experience. And this could very well be my answer. Localizers have to add flavor and their own opinions into games because that makes them look good when the game sells well. They become desirable not for their ability to accurately localize something, but for their ability to inaccurately localize something, which is honestly quite ironic. If this is true, it's understandable that localizers would have some pushback against multiple scripts because they know everyone can now see just how much they change for absolutely no reason other than to be marketable. I think you guys get the idea by now, so we'll just do one more. This comes from a localizer who I know for a fact has localized countless names and lines of text much further than they ever needed to be. They said, "Why in the world would I or any translator take criticism about translation from people who can't read the original language? It would be like a comedian questioning doctors over their treatment choices." Oh right, I get it now. I hate this mindset. You don't have to be a chef to criticize food. You don't have to be a game designer to criticize games. You don't have to be a writer to criticize writing, and you most certainly do not have to be a localizer to criticize localization. It's obvious to anyone that the name Bulbasaur in the Pokemon games was changed arbitrarily because the localizer thought that the name Fushigi Dane needed to be changed or was worse than what they could come up with for whatever reason. You don't have to speak Japanese to see that. And as someone who does speak Japanese, I also think that many changes made to games during localization mar the experience and are made for very often little to no good reason. So, I guess if worse comes to worse, I'll be allowed to speak for the fans who enjoy close localizations. But even if we set all of that aside, the people who are buying the game you localized are mostly not going to be localizers themselves. They're fans who are straight up telling you en masse that they think having more options is a good idea. So even if they don't speak the original language, maybe try to cater to them as opposed to holding to the misinformed idea that you know what's best for us. In my opinion, developers striving to cater to more fans by including options that allow the player to customize their experience is never a bad thing. And in this case, I believe that by commissioning multiple scripts, WayForward have actually added more work for localizers and given them more freedom to write what they want, contrary to what some power-hungry localizers may have you believe. I applaud WayForward for coming up with such a great solution to the age-old problem of faithful versus heavily localized, and I genuinely hope that the backlash from some people in the localization community doesn't deter other companies from attempting to normalize this practice. Since all the hubbub about this option occurred, WayForward has changed the names of the literal and new modes to original and RCG, which I think is better representative of the scripts, but I don't think the original names were necessarily bad either. Some people just took them a bit too literally. No pun intended. And lastly, I like to just say that I was actually moved to buy River City Girls 0 because of how much I wanted to support this consumer-friendly practice from WayForward, and I encourage anyone who feels a similar way about localization to do the same. But anyway, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. It always means a lot to me. I promise we'll have a non-localization related video next week for all of you not really interested in this kind of thing. If you did happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Back out. WayForward, more like way for consumers to play video games in the way that they enjoy. You guys like that one?